This is Audible.
One Nation Under Blackmail. The sordid union between intelligence and organized crime that gave rise to Jeffrey Epstein. Volume 1. Written by Whitney Elise Webb. Narrated by Grace Noble. Introduction, Volume 1. The July 2019 arrest of Jeffrey Epstein and his subsequent death in August brought national as well as international attention to a sex ring where certain members of the power elite sexually abused and exploited female minors and young women. Epstein's death, officially ruled a suicide, has been treated skeptically by many for a variety of reasons. Regardless of the real circumstances of his death, it has led to scores of Americans embracing the view that his death was both intentional and necessary to protect his powerful co-conspirators and the full extent of his covert and illegal activities. Even if one chooses not to entertain such disconcerting possibilities, it is quite apparent that most of those who aided or enabled Epstein will never see the inside of a prison cell. Though Ghislaine Maxwell is now serving a 20-year sentence, others known to have been intimately involved in his illegal activities continue to enjoy protection from the so-called sweetheart deal, or plea deal that followed Epstein's first run-in with the law for his sex trafficking activities in the mid-2000s. In addition, Ghislaine Maxwell's recent trial saw information involving third parties redacted, leading many to believe that the public will never know the names of the Johns or clients who benefited from the sex trafficking activities of Epstein and Maxwell and who were potentially blackmailed by them. Yet, for both Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, there is much more to the story. This became apparent when it emerged that Alex Acosta, then serving as Secretary of Labor in the Trump administration, had disclosed to the Trump transition team that he had previously signed off on Epstein's sweetheart deal because Epstein had belonged to intelligence. Acosta, then serving as U.S. Attorney for Southern Florida, had also been told by unspecified figures at the time that he needed to give Epstein a lenient sentence because of his links to intelligence. When Acosta was later asked if Epstein was indeed an intelligence asset in 2019, Acosta chose to neither confirm nor deny the claim. Other hints of a connection between Epstein and intelligence subsequently emerged, with reporting from a variety of sources that Epstein was affiliated with the CIA, Israeli intelligence, or both. Despite the implications and significance of these connections to intelligence, most of mainstream media declined to dig deeper into these claims, instead largely focusing on the salacious aspects of the Epstein case. The narrative soon became that Epstein was an anomaly, the sole mastermind of an industrial sex trafficking enterprise and a talented con artist. Even his closest associates and benefactors, like retail billionaire Leslie Wexner, have been taken at their word that they knew nothing of Epstein's crimes, even when there is considerable evidence to the contrary. Indeed, it was later stated by Cindy McCain, wife of former Senator John McCain, that we all knew what he, Epstein, was doing, at an event in January 2020 where she also claimed that authorities were afraid to properly apprehend him. If he was such an anomaly and a standalone con artist, how was he single-handedly able to intimidate the law enforcement apparatus of an entire nation for decades? The claim that Epstein did not have powerful backers and benefactors stands on incredibly shaky ground. Oddly enough, mainstream reporting on Epstein was once relatively open about his alleged intelligence ties, with British media reporting as early as 1992 and throughout the early 2000s that Epstein had ties to both U.S. and Israeli intelligence. In addition, also in the early 1990s, Epstein's name was mysteriously dropped from a major investigation into one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history, even though he was labeled the mastermind of that swindle in grand jury testimony. Around the same time, subsequently released White House visitor logs show that Epstein visited the Clinton White House 17 times, accompanied on most of these visits by a different, attractive young woman. Reporting on those visitor logs was largely done by a single media outlet, Britain's The Daily Mail, with hardly any American mainstream media outlets bothering to investigate these revelations about Epstein and a former U.S. president. Why was Epstein so heavily protected from justice for decades, in connection to both his sex trafficking crimes and his financial crimes? Why have the once commonly reported intelligence connections of Jeffrey Epstein now being relegated to conspiracy theory, despite evidence to the contrary? If powerful senators knew what Epstein was doing to young women and girls, who else knew, and why wasn't something done? This two-volume book endeavors to show why Jeffrey Epstein was able to engage in a series of mind-boggling crimes for decades without incident. Far from being an anomaly, Epstein was one of several men who, over the past century, have engaged in sexual blackmail activities designed to obtain damaging information, i.e. intelligence, on powerful individuals with the goal of controlling their activities and securing their compliance. Most of these individuals, including Epstein himself, have their roots in the covert world where organized crime and intelligence have intermingled and often cooperated for the better part of the last 90 years, if not longer. Perhaps most shockingly, these men are all interconnected to various degrees. Following the formal establishment of the organized crime intelligence in World War II through what is today remembered as Operation Underworld, the relationship between these two entities has since become so intertwined and so symbiotic that today it is nearly impossible to know where one ends and the other begins. As this book will show, many of the biggest scandals and events of the last century have not only been tied to these networks, but many of them also have counted with the involvement of sex traffickers and blackmailers, Epstein among them. Publicly, these men have been powerful lawyers, businessmen, and lobbyists. Their more clandestine and shadowy activities, though a matter of record, are often known only to those who are well read on certain historical events or in the field of deep politics. In order to understand Jeffrey Epstein and his activities in their full context, one must understand his powerful contacts and the structures that protected him. Those structures and those networks did not begin with Jeffrey Epstein, and they also did not die with him. In revealing his broader milieu, and that of his past associates and clients, one is left not only with a damning indictment of Jeffrey Epstein, but a damning indictment of American institutions, particularly those involved in national security matters and law enforcement. We cannot properly address the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein, nor prevent them being committed by others in the future, unless we grapple with the covert power structures that have long wielded blackmail, bribes, and assassinations as their weapons of choice to corrupt and control public institutions while manipulating and looting the public. Jeffrey Epstein was not an anomaly, and his activities represent just the tip of the veritable iceberg. Who are these people? They are the group that is popularly called the Enterprise. They are in and outside the CIA. They are mostly right-wing Republicans, but you will find a mix of Democrats, mercenaries, ex-officio mafia, and opportunists within the group. They are CEOs, they are bankers, they are presidents, they own airlines, they own national television networks. They own 6 of the 7 video documentary companies of Washington, D.C., and they do not give a damn about the law, or the Constitution, or the Congress, or the oversight committees except as something to be subverted and manipulated and lied to. They abhor sunlight and love darkness. They deal in innuendo and character assassination, and planted stories, the incomplete thought and sentence. They burn and shred files if caught, they commit perjury, and when caught, they have guaranteed sinecures with large U.S. corporations. If you let them, they will take over not only the CIA but the entire government and the world, cutting off dissent, free speech, a free media, and they will cut a deal with anyone, from the mafia to Saddam Hussein if it means more power and money. They stole $600 billion from the S&Ls and then diverted our attention to the Iraqis. They are ripping off America at a rate never before seen in history. They flooded our country with drugs from Central America during the 1980s, cut deals with Haro in Mexico, Noriega in Panama, and the Medellin and Cali cartels, and Castro, and recently the Red Mafia in the KGB. They ruin their detractors and they fear the truth. If they can, they will blackmail you. Sex, drugs, deals, whatever it takes. Former CIA officer and Iran-Contra whistleblower Bruce Hemings, circa 1990. Chapter 1. The Underworld. Of Spies and Crooks. At 2:30 in the afternoon on February 9th, 1942, a fire broke out on board the Normandy, a ship that was then in the process of being converted into a troop transporter in New York City's harbor. As the flames roared, winter winds fanned the flames, spiraling the fire up and then down onto the ship's top decks. Within hours, the Normandy began to lean to her port side, weighed down by the water that was being dumped onto the boat by fire crews. Soon, the ship capsized and an expensive, unprecedented salvage operation was mounted. Despite these efforts, repairing the ship was soon found to be too complicated and too costly, and the Normandy was scrapped in 1946. Investigations into the destruction of the Normandy quickly revealed that the cause of the disaster had been incompetence and carelessness. Yet, nevertheless, rumors grew that it had been the work of German saboteurs who were intent on disrupting America's early war efforts. Proponents of these theories argued that the alleged saboteurs sought to break down the country's logistical capabilities through attacks in ports and harbors, as well as factories and other strategic industrial locations. William B. Hurlins, the then New York Commissioner of Investigation, summed up the spirit of the times when he said, "We are faced with a grave national emergency. A blackout was imposed over the waterfront area within the 3rd Naval District, which included New York and New Jersey. Many of our ships were being sunk by enemy submarines off the Atlantic coast, and the outcome of the war hung in the balance." Management and regulation of these critical harbors and coastlines was the responsibility of the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI. An ONI inquiry was opened in May 1942 into potential saboteurs and Nazi agents operating in the ports and the possibility of U-boat movements off the East Coast. The man tasked with overseeing this inquiry was C. Radcliffe Haffendon. Several of the agents assigned to work under Haffendon had previously worked with Thomas E. Dewey, the U.S. state attorney who later served as governor of New York. Dewey was best known for his prosecution of organized crime, and through these contacts, Haffendon learned of the role played by gangsters and other criminal elements on the New York City waterfront. Dewey's chief of staff, attorney Frank Hogan, suggested to Haffendon and the ONI that they speak with a man named Joseph "Joe Sox" Lanza. Lanza was officially a business agent for the United Seafood Workers Union. He was also a mobster in his own right and was known as the racket's boss of the Fulton Fish Market in downtown New York City. Yet, compared to the stature of other criminal figures in the city, Lanza was a small fry, and he knew it. As a result, he ended up telling the ONI that they would have better luck higher up the food chain. He suggested either Meyer Lansky, who controlled the Longshoremen's Union, or Frank Costello, a gambling figure with numerous interests throughout the waterfront. But to get to them, Lanza told Haffendon he would need to first speak to Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano, at the time, was locked away in prison, having been put there by Thomas Dewey. A delicate series of negotiations were subsequently launched in what is now known as Operation Underworld. This operation, which the government was forced to reluctantly acknowledge after decades of public denials, involved the recruitment of high-level organized crime figures for work with American intelligence services, justified by wartime necessity. Not long after Operation Underworld had been given the go-ahead, Luciano agreed to the ONI's requests, and his prison cell soon became a hub for meetings between him and his criminal associates, meetings in which they would coordinate counterintelligence activities with the Navy. Despite Operation Underworld's initial and relatively narrow objectives, the scope of the operation organically expanded. Before long, Luciano and his colleagues, Meyer Lansky chief among them, were helping the ONI cultivate intelligence for the Allied invasion of Sicily. Lower-ranking mob figures and immigrants were frequently brought to Haffendon's offices for questioning. Names and contact information for friendly Sicilians, many of whom were mafia figures, were provided to ONI agents for use in the military campaign. While the resulting collaborations between the mafia and the military on the beaches and in the villages of Sicily have slipped into legend, the legacy of Operation Underworld has endured and undeniably forever altered the United States of America and beyond. Indeed, Operation Underworld was the beginning of the creation of a new underworld entirely, one built on the cooperation, if not outright symbiosis, between organized crime and American intelligence. Shadowy alliances. Lucky Luciano was born in Sicily in 1897 and arrived on American shores in 1906. At a young age, he formed his own gang, which offered protection to Jewish immigrants from Italian and Irish organized crime elements in exchange for small fees. This protection, unsurprisingly, was tantamount to extortion, and the money he accrued allowed him to begin expanding into other rackets, including, notably, prostitution. Early on, he met and formed an alliance with another young gangster named Frank Costello, an immigrant from Calabria, Italy. Together, the two consolidated their power by taking control of the numerous environs now considered typical of organized crime: prostitution, narcotics, and even organized labor in New York City's docks. As their business expanded, so too did their revenue. Soon, Luciano and his cohorts were being propelled to the heights of power in New York City. Thomas Dewey once commented that Luciano's business was far-flung and brought in a colossal revenue. This was estimated to be far, far in excess of $12 million a year. Key to Luciano and Costello's operation was the fact that it had overcome the traditional bifurcation of organized crime into ethnic enclaves. For the first time in Luciano's growing criminal empire, Italian, Jewish, and Irish criminal networks intermingled and cooperated with one another. However, this early cooperation lacked the cohesion and integration that the networks born out of Luciano's and Costello's enterprise would develop in the years to come. Joining Luciano and Costello in their criminal enterprise was Meyer Lansky and his close friend, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Lansky was well connected in Jewish mob circles, and he, along with Siegel, had amassed significant wealth during the Prohibition era. Lansky, whose long shadow is cast across the entire history of organized crime in the 20th century, was something of a visionary. Various accounts paint him as the intellectual architect behind the multi-ethnic organized crime model that Luciano successfully pursued. Lansky was also instrumental in bringing mob groups into the world of gambling, helping set up casinos in the Caribbean that would be utilized to wash the money generated by their various vices and rackets. Perhaps most important of all was that Lansky had also helped develop the use of a complex banking network, which he adopted in an effort to avoid the fate of Al Capone. After all, Capone had not been taken down for murder or extortion, but for tax evasion. This Luciano-Costello-Lansky-Siegel alliance was the basis of what subsequently became known as the National Crime Syndicate. Far from the well-organized image of the mafia often promoted by the media, the National Crime Syndicate operated loosely at best, and according to some commentators, did not actually exist in any meaningful way. Such arguments might be going a step too far, although they are worth considering. The National Crime Syndicate might be best understood as a social network, a sprawling, faction-filled web of associations and organizations that either collaborated or competed, depending on the situation or the spoils. In 1936, this emerging crime network took what, at first glance, appeared to be a major blow following the arrest and successful prosecution of Luciano by Thomas E. Dewey in a spectacular, if not sensational, trial. Luciano's apparent downfall came via an assault on New York City's prostitution rackets, which his organization firmly controlled. As Alfred McCoy summarizes, Dewey's investigators felt that the forced prostitution charge would be more likely to offend public sensibilities and secure a conviction. A handful of prostitutes who worked in Luciano's brothels testified against him, and a New York court quickly sentenced the gangster to a 30 to 50-year jail term. Dewey's role in this affair is quite interesting. 6 years later, when he ran to secure the presidential nomination for the Republican Party, he joined forces with John Foster Dulles, the brother of Allen Dulles, best known for his role as the first civilian head of the CIA in the early years of the Cold War. Dulles, a member of the internationalist camp of American politics that typified the attitudes of the elite Eastern establishment, impressed upon Dewey the importance of overcoming the isolationist factions of the Republican Party. What Dulles got in exchange for his steering of Dewey in pursuit of political power was his own rise through the ranks of the party, ultimately culminating in his service as President Dwight D. Eisenhower's Secretary of State. Even more curious was an investment that Dewey made during the 1950s in an entity called the Mary Carter Paint Company, later renamed Resorts International. Mary Carter was controlled by the Crosby family, and its operations were overseen by the most practical-minded of the family's sons, James Crosby. Mary Carter was deeply tied to organized crime networks. It worked closely in developing businesses in the Bahamas, hand in hand with a number of Meyer Lansky frontmen, while James' brother, Peter Crosby, was a notorious confidence man with an impressive roster of criminal contacts. It had also been widely rumored that Mary Carter was a CIA front company. The OSS. Lurking in the background of Operation Underworld, which had seen the ONI directly recruit Luciano, was the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the wartime forerunner to the CIA and America's first robust national intelligence organization. The precise role that the OSS played in the affair isn't exactly clear. According to George White, a notorious agent of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics who had been recruited into the OSS, he had been propositioned by an organized crime associate to enlist Luciano in exchange for a pardon. But this was a bridge too far. An alliance between the OSS and a person of Luciano's reputation would be a very naive way of doing business. White maintained that he felt it was outrageous to entertain the proposition, even for the OSS, who were willing to do almost anything. White would make these statements in the course of federal testimony, and, in all likelihood, he was lying to protect the OSS. According to Richard Harris Smith, an historian of the OSS, Earl Brennan, an OSS officer in Italy, was kept in the loop regarding negotiations between Luciano and the ONI. Meanwhile, Assistant District Attorney Murray Gurfein, who handled the legal end of the Luciano negotiations, subsequently went to Europe to serve as a colonel in the OSS. The OSS was many things, operating in many different theaters. In Europe, it ran a fairly unsuccessful paramilitary campaign. However, in the China-Burma-India theater, its military operations achieved remarkable results. When it came to spycraft, its supporters gushed with praise, while its detractors regarded the tales later woven by its veterans as worthy of skepticism. The OSS was frequently, and accurately, seen as a social club. While its ranks did boast a great many military officers and figures from other government agencies like the FBI and the FBN, its leadership and higher-ranking administrative posts tended to be secured by the sons of the country's wealthiest elite. In London, Madrid, Geneva, Paris, and elsewhere, posts were held by members of the Mellon family of Pittsburgh, the family behind the Gulf oil fortune. Heirs of the Morgan family also secured positions within the agency, as did members of the DuPont and the Vanderbilt families. Only the Rockefellers were conspicuously absent from the OSS, writes Richard Harris Smith, adding that Nelson Rockefeller headed his own agency, the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. David Rockefeller, Nelson's brother, also reportedly ran his own intelligence apparatus during the war. The agency itself was something of a brainchild, at least partially, of General William J. Donovan, a prominent New York City antitrust lawyer and veteran of World War I. Along with figures like Dewey and Dulles, Donovan was the consummate Eastern establishment insider. He maintained a deep preoccupation with organization and rationalization, which filtered into his work defending the trusts and combines that dotted the corporate landscape of his day. He was also a firm internationalist when it came to his political outlook. During the interwar years, Donovan had acted as an agent for various corporate interests, and had even traveled to Russia on behalf of the Morgans to collect organs to collect information on the developments of the Bolshevik Revolution. In the course of his wartime intelligence work, Donovan was first appointed by President Roosevelt to head the Office of the Coordinator of Information, COI, which was intended to help coordinate the scattered intelligence outfits and military organizations that communicated infrequently and cooperated even less. COI was the seed from which the OSS would later spring. Under Donovan's direction, it became a clearinghouse for military and political propaganda. This was in no small part thanks to Donovan's close friend, a British intelligence operative named William Stevenson. Stevenson was the wartime head of a British intelligence unit in the United States, headquartered in New York City and known as the British Security Coordination, BSC. He reported to Stuart Menzies, who was then serving as the head of MI6. Menzies had tasked Stevenson with establishing relations on the highest possible level between the British SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, another name for MI6, and the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Stevenson and the BSC operated from an office located in Rockefeller Center's International Building, which was also the home of numerous other BSC front organizations. Stevenson also worked closely with other British intelligence agencies, including MI6 itself and the Special Operations Executive, SOE, which had begun its life as Section D of MI6. In agreement with Menzies' mandate, Stevenson developed a close working relationship with J. Edgar Hoover, who seemed to be enthusiastic about being a liaison to British intelligence on matters concerning the war in Europe. At this stage, the U.S. had yet to enter the conflict. Reportedly, the BSC provided the FBI with over 100,000 confidential reports, while Hoover kept the British in the loop with American reports on German naval movements and the like. The relationship between Hoover and Stevenson would ultimately break down by 1941. Soon after, Stevenson began to cultivate William Donovan, who increasingly challenged Hoover's position as the sole conduit between the Americans and the British. When Donovan was appointed by Roosevelt as the coordinator of information, and subsequently formed the OSS, an intense bureaucratic struggle erupted between Hoover and his rivals. As will be discussed in greater detail in the next chapter, this struggle allegedly led Donovan to coordinate with organized crime kingpins, namely Meyer Lansky, to blackmail Hoover in an effort to bring him to heel. Stevenson did more than simply cultivate Donovan. In 1940, he reported back to his handlers in England that there is no doubt we can achieve infinitely more through Donovan than through any other individual. He is very receptive and can be trusted to represent our needs in the right quarters and in the right way in the USA. Donovan's COI and OSS were, in all actuality, the offspring of these British-led efforts, and a great deal of the decisions Donovan made were influenced by figures tied to Stevenson's BSC. Before the COI was up and running, for example, Donovan conferred closely with Robert Sherwood, a playwright, ardent interventionist, and close confidant of President Roosevelt. On June 16, 1941, writes Thomas Mall, Sherwood sent to Donovan a list of people he thought he could trust for the work we discussed yesterday evening at your home. At the time, Sherwood was working closely with the BSC, even sending them copies of speeches he had written for the president prior to Roosevelt receiving them.
Hello?
Hi, how you doing?
I'm alright.
I took my Atarax, and I also remembered why I stopped taking Zyprexa because it makes me fat.